In the annals of modern industry, there are stories of men who built empires with steel, and others who built them with code. But the story of Elias Thorne is about a man who built his empire with the sheer force of a mastered tongue. Elias was a visionary structural engineer, an algorithmic architect, whose intellect was a cathedral of complex calculations, a man who could solve equations that would make supercomputers sweat. In his home country, he was a titan, a living legend of efficiency. However, the moment he stepped across an international border, he became a shadow. He was a victim of the fluency gap, a psychological and linguistic canyon where his genius-level technical mind was trapped behind a primitive, rusted gate of broken English. For years he sat in global summits like a silent statue, watching men with half his talent but twice his vocabulary walk away with the contracts that should have been his. He was tired of being the most brilliant man in the room whom nobody actually heard. The ultimate breaking point, the Black Monday of his professional life, occurred during a high-stakes presentation on the 50th floor of a glass and steel skyscraper in Manhattan. Elias had 10 minutes to pitch a revolutionary sustainable infrastructure project to a group of the world's most predatory venture capitalists. This was the moment his life was supposed to change. But as he stood before the investors, the air in the room seemed to turn to lead. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. When he opened his mouth, the disaster was instantaneous. He was so paralyzed by the fear of making a grammar mistake, so obsessed with the correctness of his prepositions, that his delivery became robotic, hesitant, and hollow. He used safe, elementary words like good and fast, because he was terrified of mispronouncing sophisticated synonyms. A shark-like investor, sensing blood in the water, interrupted him with a scathing, sarcastic remark about his unusual syntax. Elias crumbled. He lost his train of thought, stumbled through a series of agonizing UHMS, and was dismissed with a cold nod before he even reached his final slide. That night, standing on the balcony of his hotel looking out at the New York skyline, Elias realized a brutal, tectonic truth. In the global area, if you cannot defend your ideas with eloquence and authority, your ideas, no matter how brilliant, simply do not exist. Driven by a state of calculated rage, Elias returned home and began a 3-year odyssey of total identity re-engineering. He realized that traditional language classes were a graveyard for ambition. He needed to treat English not as a school subject, but as a biological operating system. He initiated the burn the ships strategy, effectively banning his native language from his existence. He purged his digital life, switching every device, every news feed, and every professional journal to English. He moved into an international district and cut ties with anyone who wouldn't speak English to him. He even began to narrate his inner monologue aloud, forcing his brain to bridge the gap between thought and sound. If he couldn't name an object in his environment in English, he wasn't allowed to use it. He moved beyond simple vocabulary and focused on the physiology of sound, hiring an elite accent coach to master vocal placement. He spent thousands of hours shadowing, the grueling process of mimicking the speeches of world leaders and master orators second by second, mimicking their cadence, their stress patterns, and the emotional weight of their delivery. He understood a secret of the powerful. Successful people speak slower, not faster. He mastered the power of the pause to command the oxygen in the room. Next, Elias focused on high-leverage vocabulary, building what he called his dialect of success, a curated list of verbs that implied action and nouns that radiated stability. He replaced passive, weak phrases with power structures, mastering transitional anchors like, "The core challenge we are addressing is," or, "Let's look at this from a strategic standpoint." These weren't just words, they were tactical maneuvers that bought his brain time to process complex thoughts, while maintaining the external appearance of absolute, unshakable confidence. To harden his psychological resolve, he engaged in social warfare. He joined theater troupes to practice vocal projection, and called international customer support lines for hours, just to practice the art of high-pressure negotiation over fake insurance policies. He was building language calluses, the thick psychological skin required to stay calm when a conversation turns hostile or the stakes become life-altering. He was no longer just learning a language. He was constructing a new version of himself, Elias 2.0. 3 years after his New York humiliation, Elias Thorne returned to that very same boardroom on the 50th floor. He didn't look like the same man. His posture was open, his gaze was a steady beam of iron, and he carried an aura of quiet, dangerous authority. When the same shark-like investor tried to interrupt his opening statement, Elias didn't flinch. He didn't stutter. He simply paused, let the silence hang for 3 powerful seconds, met the man's eyes with a slight, confident smile, and said with a deep, melodic resonance, "I appreciate the interruption, as it highlights a critical misunderstanding of the risk parity model we've built. Allow me to clarify the underlying mechanics before we dive into the data." The room went silent. The investors weren't just looking at his blueprints anymore. They were looking at a leader. Elias spoke for nearly an hour, weaving a narrative that turned complex engineering into a compelling vision of the future. He used humor, he used gravitas, and he used the English language as a surgeon uses a scalpel, with absolute devastating precision. By the end of the meeting, he hadn't just secured the $500 million in funding. He had secured a partnership that would eventually make him a global household name. Elias Thorne's epic journey is the ultimate proof that English is the great equalizer, the primary currency of the modern age. When you master it, you aren't just learning to talk, you are gaining the keys to the kingdom of global opportunity.